Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion. Today's episode is sponsored by Surfshark.
Morally, we have to intervene, we have to try and protect these people, but in doing so, we're possibly making a dangerous situation even worse. And that just felt like this kind of moral vice that I just didn't know how we were going to work our way out of.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In this second episode exploring the Darknet assassination market, we're talking again to Carl Miller, host of the investigative podcast Kill List, which has traced a story of murder-for-hire scams and the thin divide between online fantasy and real-world violence. With the help of white-hat hacker Chris Montero, Carl and his team investigated a hitman-for-hire site in 2020, finding 175 names of ordinary people who someone had ordered to be murdered. In fact, the site was a scam, but it exposed real people who ordered violence online and would go on to commit actual violence. In the last episode, we explored two of these cases in detail, stories of abusive men. How the Kill List exposed Stephen Allwine, who murdered his wife Amy, and the case of Dr. Ron Ilg, who ordered kidnapping and violence against a girlfriend and colleagues online, but was stopped through the intervention of Carl and his team, alerting the FBI to the significance of this hire a hitman site. In this episode, we're going to take a look at a third case, one with a difference. This time, a woman ordering a hit on her air traffic controller husband. Carl, welcome back to True Criminals.
Thank you.
Before we move on to our third case, how do you feel, Carl, as a journalist, that this story has kind of overtaken your life? These are people's lives at stake and you've uncovered all this, but how do you feel about that? And how do you cope with the stress of it all and the worry and all the different aspects that we've touched on?
It was very difficult for all of us. There was a small team. There was Caroline Thornham, the producer that was there from the very beginning to the very end. There was Chris, of course, and there were a few others. It was a very tight-knit, if somewhat ragtag group that had to deal with this. And I think, in all honesty, it was traumatizing for us. This wasn't something that we wanted to do. And some people are, oh yeah, you say you wanted to close this to police, but you were trying to do this journalistically. I genuinely was trying to get rid of this from the very beginning. I had absolutely no inclination in this kind of investigation. It shouldn't have been us doing this for the years that it was. I was multiple times going all around the world to police forces to try and get them to actually investigate the site properly. And because we didn't anticipate it, and because it kind of all rolled out and the list was getting longer and the investigations becoming more complex, there were more of them, we just had no time back then to really create any kind of support structure for ourselves. And that meant that there was a period of time, and this is years ago now, so I think we've all come to terms with this, but there was a period of time where I think our mental health was really, really getting stretched. I was having nightmares pretty often. I was dreaming that one of the perpetrators was kicking the door down of my house. There was not really a moment when we weren't thinking about a case. And obviously, emotionally, you care about these people, especially when you get to know them. They are people. You don't want anything to happen to them. But also we were having to make sometimes really very weighty decisions constantly, every day. It was like, okay, the journalist is outside. Do we go up to the door? Do they knock the door? How should we contact them? No one was at home. Should they stay there? Should they go home? Should they come back? Oh, but the person's actually on the site sending in more orders, so we need to be fast. There was this constant breathless tumbling of, I would say, life or death decisions that we're having to make absolutely constantly. And I just felt sooner or later someone was going to die.
I must say I've had, over the years, many frustrations with police forces, but nothing quite like this.
I'm quite pro-police. I'd spent time embedded in a cybercrime team in the police. I'd worked with the police quite a lot. Coming into this, I was actually very optimistic about the role of the police. I felt like I could work with them. I felt like there were lots of good people in the police that were doing their best, often in very difficult circumstances. So I don't criticise the police lightly when I say that the behaviour of some police forces around the world was totally outrageous and patently incompetent. Some police forces. They're not a single character in the story, obviously.
Shall we look at the third case? It offers a different twist. This time, it wasn't a husband targeting a wife, but a woman trying to arrange her ex-husband's murder. And it was actually you and other journalists who helped stop this. Tell us about this story, Carl.
Yes, the case of Kelly Harper. So we go over to Wisconsin, and a case where the target is a man called Travis. He's an air traffic controller, a former Marine, and a man that was very difficult for us to reach, actually. I've just been saying we were having to make scary decisions. This was one of them. The local journalist was driving to his house, and he'd passed his house on this quiet residential street, and it looked like it was fortified. The blinds were down, the door was shut, and we really did not know how we were going to safely make contact with Travis. We were actually worried that he knew that something was up. Maybe there was some other indication that he'd had, that he was being targeted. He's a former Marine. We were like, he's going to have a gun. Is he going to shoot through the door when the guy knocks on the door? How do we reassure him that we're not, in fact, the hitman? And it's also another case where even face-to-face, he initially doesn't believe us. So Dylan Brogan, the local journalist, he knocks on the door, makes his best attempt at being like, Travis, I think there's information that you're going to want to know. And Travis just shuts the door in his face. Doesn't shoot him, thank God, but doesn't believe him either. Dylan's driving away. And in this last-ditch attempt to try and convince Travis that something was happening, I was like, right, I'm going to use my final secret weapon, my British accent.
That served me well when I lived in America, actually, as a UK journalist.
Right, I think there is something in that,
There
especially
is.
in the States, where you phone up with your sharpest cut glass English accent, really, really like authoritative and clear. And I was like, Travis, there is information you need to know. And weirdly, that time, it was the face-to-face didn't work and the phone call did.
So what was the information that you were trying to get him? Who was Kelly Harper and what was she trying to do?
So each and every time, what we were trying to do with all these cases was to pass them the murder order itself and then work with them to disclose it to the police. Each of these cases, we had a payment, we had the murder order, we had the messages from the site. And that's what we wanted to give these people. So for Travis, there was fairly long information about him. If I remember correctly, there was a picture of his car that had been loaded onto site as well. Remember, they can load images in. And often they load an image of the target, of course, but this orderer had also loaded in a picture of his car, and you can see, and it's quite sinister, the shadow of another car that's passing. So we felt like that one was not available on the internet generally. We were like, oh my God, that has been taken by the perpetrator. She, as it turned out, was driving past his car and then took a photo of his car. And that was the information we disclosed to him. It was hours of conversation with Travis. He initially was chewing gum relentlessly, quite mechanically. He was slightly hostile to us. But then over the course of hours, he just melted. He warmed up as a human being and began to tell us what on earth was happening in his life. And there was absolutely no hesitation in his mind about who it was.
And the FBI traced the murder plot back to Kelly.
Yes.
What did they trace and what was she trying to make happen?
She was trying to have him killed. This was all in the context of a years-long, extremely acrimonious feud between Travis and Kelly. They were estranged. They were either divorced or in the middle of it at this point. And they were fighting over the custody of their children. And Kelly had made a whole series of allegations that Travis was abusive to the kids. And they'd been raging across the courts of Sun Prairie. They'd been fighting this feud in the hospitals where essentially Kelly, I believe, was trying to deny him access to their clinical records or any say over any kind of treatment they needed. in the schools. I think at one point Travis had been to a recital and had been detained by the school. And slowly over this time, it was transpiring that Travis was not abusive. And finally, and this was, I think, what caused Kelly to turn to the site, the family court in Wisconsin had ruled and said, there is just no evidence that Travis is abusive. You need to stop making these allegations. If you keep making these allegations, I'm going to start fighting against you now. And Travis had been awarded essentially a legal status in Wisconsin where he could break any deadlock between him and Kelly. So essentially he was becoming the recognized guardian of the children. His visitation rights had been creeping up as well over this time. And so she was losing essentially the legal case against him. And that's why probably, maybe, she turned to the site to have him killed.
So the FBI got onto the case. They found the evidence enough to arrest Kelly, and she was convicted. So this is a rare example of journalists actually saving somebody's life. How do you feel about that?
To be honest, the feeling was a momentary one of relief and a lessening of tension, but then you're just moving on to the next one. There was very little time for us to catch our breath. This one was, I might say, especially terrifying because our intervention itself was possibly dangerously destabilising. Travis was really worried that Kelly might do something actually to the children. And that first night, the police, who eventually had gone over to Travis's house, they said, okay, we're going to tell Kelly not to contact you. And he was like, no, don't do that. If she knows that journalists are onto this, that the police are onto this, she might do something. And all these moral conundra that we're having to navigate. And to be honest, this was one of the sternest, this kind of trade-off between damned if you do and damned if you don't. Morally, we have to intervene. We have to try and protect these people. But in doing so, we're possibly making a dangerous situation even worse. And that just felt like this kind of moral trap or vice or something that I just didn't know how we were going to work our way out of.
In June 2021, Kelly did plead guilty and a judge sentenced her to 72 months in federal prison. That's 6 years, I think. 6 years, to me, doesn't sound very high for plotting a murder.
I think we always think that sentences probably aren't long enough, don't you, when you look at horrendousness of the crime. And I'll just caveat to say I am not a judge or a legal system, and they are what they are. But it was strange what crimes were really being prosecuted. To me, this is conspiracy to commit murder. It's quite simple. What they were actually prosecuted for sometimes was things like use of actually, in the US, they have a strangely specific crime, use of an interstate communication system to plot a murder, I believe, was the actual crime. But quite often it would be harassment or aggravated harassment or things like that. It was quite clear, firstly, that Western legal systems don't have an agreed upon view on what this crime is. And secondly, I think often the penalties were not what I would have put them at.
Is there any impetus to introduce new laws to take account of something like this you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Saving lives is one thing. Changing the law for journalists is always a battle honour in a way. But there's nothing going on. You haven't prompted that kind of legal debate.
No, not to my knowledge. I think what we did see over the course of the investigation, our access to the site was present for about 2 years. So there's 175 cases that we ultimately do disclose. That's over the course of about 2 years. What we do see over that time, I think, is a precedent being set. So initially, the police had literally no idea what we were talking about or how to investigate it. But actually, by the end, I think the crime type was being taken more seriously. So one of the final cases, and spoiler alert, everyone, the police ultimately probably run the site themselves. They arrest Jura, then we can see convictions, but they're not coming from us. We get locked out of the site, but we do see convictions. And there was one in Austria, and it was a massive police operation. There were 5 different Austrian police forces involved. There were 100 police officers. There was the interior minister got involved. It was just night and day compared to Travis's case, where it was an intern in the police in some prairie who was scratching his head and wondering what to do.
We've talked about American cases. Did you ever discover any UK cases?
Yes, there's been convictions here. One prosecuted, convicted case was this is going to sound odd to people, a Sports Direct love triangle in Milton Keynes. There was a manager having an affair with 2 different Sports Direct employees, and one tried to have the other one killed using this website.
As journalists, Martin and I are always on the move, covering breaking stories around the globe. When we finally carve out some precious downtime, we love to relax on holiday with our friends and our family. Over time, we've noticed something strange. The same flight, hotels and car rentals can vary dramatically in price, depending on where we're browsing from. It's like the internet treats you differently based on your location. Take flights, hotels, or even rental cars. Prices can change based on where the website thinks you are. The exact same ticket might be cheaper if you book from another country. That's price discrimination, and it can really add up. And here's another trick these sites use, tracking your searches. If they see you checking that same trip more than once, the price might actually go up. With Surfshark, all of that gets blocked. Your browsing stays private, and those sneaky algorithms don't get to play games with your wallet. One of the things I like best about Surfshark is unlimited devices. Whether it's my laptop at the airport, my tablet in the hotel, or my phone on the go, I'm covered at all times without juggling logins. On top of that, Surfshark has a service called Alert. It watches out for your email and lets you know if your details ever appear in a data breach. Think of it as an early warning system before your private information ends up in the wrong hands. Travel smarter and stay connected wherever you go with Surfshark. Head to surfshark.com/truecriminals or use the code TrueCriminals at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. Have there ever been cases, Carl, thinking of your mental health with all this and that of your team, where you've got involved and you've tried to warn somebody and it hasn't worked, they haven't listened, and they have ended up losing their lives? Not obviously because of you, but that somebody has gone ahead with killing the person when they've realised that their hit online isn't real.
Thank God, the cases that we fully disclose, no, there was never a time when we spoke to someone and then they ended up being killed. Obviously, it was an outcome that I dreaded. I also dreaded it because I didn't know whether the team could continue if that happened. This was hard enough when we were succeeding. If we had to deal with that, I really don't know how we could have gone back the next day and continued. I'm genuinely quite surprised that it ended up being public. I think there was a real possibility that this was a story we could never tell, and it would have had to have stayed secret forever, maybe. And certainly one where we had no idea how long it was going to go on for. So the actual just simply continuing to do it was something which we worried a lot about.
And have you ever worried about repercussions? Because there are people out there serving jail time who, now this story is out there, do you ever worry that they might come back after you for putting that warning out?
I think that any decent person would have done what we did. I don't think you can unsee a kill order. And I don't think most people could look themselves in the mirror if they see a kill order and then don't do something about it. So I don't dwell on the consequences, if I'm honest. I'm proud of what we did. I would do it again. And sometimes important things that one does in one's life carry a bit of risk with them, and so be it.
There's very little history in this country of anybody shooting the messenger in that sense, but you're working in a world that I know very little about, the dark web. You're working on an international story. Do you worry a bit about your own safety, having exposed all this?
I worry about a lot of things. I'm a pretty nervous guy. I'm also a hypochondriac, by the way. I can't drive. I don't like even running particularly fast. Yeah, there's lots of things I worry about. But of all of them, to be honest, dwelling on what people may or may not do, I've not really found to be particularly beneficial. We did what we did, and we did our best. And I truly think that anyone listening to this would, in the same circumstances, probably have done the same thing. And I think that that's ultimately the only thing that really matters, is you just do your best and try to act in a way which is reasonably decent to other human beings.
You're right. I think they probably would have reacted in the same way, but I'm sure Martin and I are sitting here quite relieved that we haven't uncovered this. Hats off to you and your team, Carl. What you've achieved is truly remarkable. You have saved people's lives, and it's been pretty jaw-dropping listening to just some of those stories.
And beyond the shocking details, you've spent years investigating this. What bigger lessons do you take away from it? What can society learn from what you uncovered?
That domestic violence is a thing and it shouldn't need the darknet to be spotlit. That quite often the targets, when we reached them, were trying to raise the alarm anyway. And in this strange, ironic way, the fact that we, as journalists, had uncovered something from the darknet was often the only way that the case actually saw any light. There was a case in Bath, Lisa. It took years. She waited longer for the person to be convicted than the person is spending in prison. She went to everybody with this. She went to the NHS. She went to her MP, who actually campaigns on victims' rights and on domestic violence. The MP gave her 5 minutes in her office. And the police and the CPS. I feel like in cases like Lisa's, she is a brave and normal woman. She was actually in many ways a reminder to me that really any of us could end up on the kill list. It really just came out of nowhere. She didn't expect it. And then when you do turn to these institutions that are there that you expect actually will be there for you when you really need them to be, like the police, like the Crown Prosecution Service, actually they were found to be really, really lacking in that case. The amazing evidence that they managed to uncover, which took them months and months and months to finally turn into prosecution, was the perpetrator filming himself, putting a camera in her bathroom. That is not Sherlock Holmes level of investigations. This is putting a memory card in a computer and looking what's on it. So that's one thing. Often people really were struggling to be heard before we turned up. I think the other big lesson that I take away from this is around the police and cybercrime. I don't want to sound too histrionic, but I think we're living through probably the worst crisis of law enforcement in the history of modern policing. I think the entire policing model doesn't work for cybercrime at all. The crime on the internet, like anything on the internet, travels unbelievably easily across borders. And what really, really doesn't travel across borders is police. And I know this because I've actually spent time in cybercrime units. We've got 43 local police forces scattered across the UK, each one of which has a tiny little, well, sometimes a big, sometimes a very small cybercrime team. And that cybercrime team just doesn't have the powers or the capabilities to reach across those borders and bring often the evidence and the perpetrators and the victims all into a single place. And that means that even when, like in this case, we actually have really, really clear evidence, most of those cases have not been prosecuted. So 175 paid for kill orders that we disclosed to the police. I think we've had 32 convictions now.
The anonymity of the dark web, I think, really has given people a false sense of security. Allwine, Ilg, Harper and others assumed that they could literally get away with murder behind this veil of cryptocurrency and secrecy, yet their digital footprints ultimately exposed them. But it sounds to me like perhaps police aren't as developed in seeing those footprints on the dark web, and there's borders, whether that be counties in Britain or country borders. And are you campaigning in any way for that to change? Because it's taken alert journalists and teams like you to unmask some of this.
It's a great question. I'm a think tanker and a journalist and a writer. I'm not really a campaigner. I'm not really very good at it. But for what it's worth, yes, it's actually a policy proposal I've been banging on about for many years before Kill List came along, which is that I think it is unbelievably obvious that we need to create a single national unit to police cybercrime, a single centre. Victim care can happen locally, of course, that makes sense. But in terms of the actual investigation, it makes absolutely no sense to split that into 43 police forces, which simply the police force that happens to be near the victim makes absolutely no difference really when it comes to investigating that. There should be a single unit, a single force, a single set of capabilities and tools and powers.
Do you feel that too, Martin?
I've been covering crime for donkey's years, and I've seen various forces bragging about how they've finally caught up and are setting up such units. But there's also the National Crime Agency, which I thought had a national cybercrime capability. I don't know whether you ever had any involvement in the National Crime Agency here.
The NCA has a national capability generally for crime. they actually do have the powers that are probably needed to create a national cybercrime centre. They have quite wide-ranging powers in terms of compelling local police forces to do things. The problem with the NCA is that they're very small. There's not that many investigating officers. And what that means, and I think this is the same with like GCHQ and other bits of the British security establishment, is that the floor of seriousness that they really need in order to actually investigate a crime is extremely high. So really, the NCA and GCHQ are investigating crimes which pose some kind of national level threat to the UK's prosperity and security.
Yes, drug trafficking and people smuggling.
And massive versions of those. Not just people smuggling as individuals, but giant organised criminal endeavours. That's really what my understanding is that the NCA really focuses on. And I understand, in the broad scheme of things, the number of UK targets is not going to ever exceed the threshold that the NCA would need as it currently stands in its current posture to investigate. And I think that's a really big gap. There's this really big gap between individual police forces, I think, being overwhelmed by the complexity and technicality of this kind of investigation, and then the NCA that wouldn't be, but actually has a million other things to do and not enough resources to do even those.
You almost need, don't you, an international unit, as you said, just one unit that specialises in it all, because location on the dark web doesn't really matter. You then work with teams on the ground.
Yeah.
There must be so much dark, gruesome stuff happening on the dark web. Ultimately, the kill list feels like it holds up a mirror to society, and it's not a pretty reflection, misogyny, hatred, cruelty. But we have to face the facts here that the true criminals weren't anonymous hitmen who do this for a living. They were ordinary people, weren't they? Spouses and lovers and colleagues.
Yeah, but it also is a story of recovery and resilience and courage. Let's not forget the local journalists. Let's not forget Elena, the Swiss woman, who was the first person that I managed to successfully warn. Her husband was convicted, and I met her years later in London, where she'd been to back-to-back high teas at the Ritz and the Dorchester. She was about to see Phantom of the Opera on the West End. And I asked her, I said, have you truly managed to move on with your life? And she said, yes. She said, I don't think about him anymore. I don't care. She was booking her next holiday, travelling down the Amazon River. So it is a story about all of this as well. I've never seen the kill list as being monochrome. I think it's a story where the worst, yes, but also some of the best bits of human nature can be seen.
Carl, you've covered 10 stories in great detail on your award-winning podcast. You've talked about 175 stories that you managed to narrow down, and you've only told a fraction of those on your podcast. So I guess we might look forward to perhaps a second series.
Well, you have to wait and see.
And if you do a second series, then you've got an open invitation to come on True Criminals. Thank you so much for sharing what is really a remarkable journey. I've known Martin for nearly 40 years, and I can tell that your jaw's been dropped on the floor when you're listening to all the things that Carl's found himself involved with. We're going to put a link to your podcast in our show notes. And tell us, where can listeners find you if they want to hear more?
Well, as they say, everywhere where you get your podcast, Kill List isn't hard to find.
Carl, you've amazed an old crime hack.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey listeners, your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.